Hello, everybody. My name is Dr. Shakhnoza Kayumova, and I'm an associate professor at the University of Massachusetts, Dartmouth. I'm the founder and director of Science, Language, and Identity Lab. I'm very excited today to be with you all and to talk to you about issues related to identity theories, methodologies, and the ways in which identity can help us to think about science learning. Before we will start our engagement, I would like to give you a little bit of a snippet about my own research to you and share with you some of my own research. Here is a little video that describes my current research around issues of identity.
We are the STEAM Language Learning and Identity Research Group. Our research is focused on questions aimed at improving equitable outcomes in science education. Specifically, our 3-year longitudinal study draws on social positioning theory to examine the relationship between language and science identity development among culturally and linguistically diverse learners, also known as English language learners. Social positioning is both the learner's perception of who they are and their ability to engage in science, and how others in their immediate environment recognize these performances. We hypothesize that when students' cultural and linguistic backgrounds are positioned as assets in their learning, this is likely to have a positive impact on their developing science identity. In contrast, when students' backgrounds are positioned as a deficit, this impacts their self-perceptions and learning negatively. To test this hypothesis, we partnered with local schools, families, and university STEM faculty to design a 2-week summer program called STEAM Your Way to College. The program utilizes social positioning and is aimed at dismantling language-based deficit narratives about students' backgrounds and equip them and their teachers with tools that position them as epistemically and cognitively advantaged. For the past 2 summers, close to 100 middle school students who are identified as English language learners participated at the local university for 2 weeks and worked with STEM faculty, graduate students, and high school mentors on locally relevant STEM-based projects, such as issues related to environmental justice and thermodynamics. We also see the impact of our findings not just with students, but with teachers and mentors who share similar backgrounds.
Actually bring a wealth of knowledge with them, and teachers need to be trained in how to figure out the expressions that the kids are giving and what knowledge they have. Sometimes if teachers aren't trained, they don't realize that language does not mean that they don't have the science knowledge if they're not speaking the current language of the classroom, and that's okay. And so you have to find ways to reach to dig out and let them express.
English is not my first language, so I could identify with the kids because sometimes I don't know how to express myself in English. So I helped them and I felt what they felt when they don't know how to express themselves, and I helped translate and motivate them that they can do it.
We call people scientists, engineers, mathematicians, and they're like, I am that. So I think being able to see them embody what we already knew that they could do has been probably the most rewarding for me. Thanks for watching, from our STEM program to yours.
So now let's look at some of the identity studies in science education. Before we are going to dive into theories and methodologies, what I would like you to do is to take a look at this activity. What I'm going to show to you is I will show you some series of photos, and I would like you to take a note as you look at these photos. In your notes, describe people you see in these photos. Ask yourself, who are these people? And how do you know? What is your evidence as you think about or identify a person as this or that? What are they doing? How do you know? Again, think of an evidence. Pick a specific photo to pay attention. Describe people. What are they doing? Are they participating in something? Are they speaking, looking at the phone, doing nothing? Again, depending on the photo you choose, provide as much description as possible. Last, are they all doing science? Or which ones are doing science? So again, how do you know? Here are some photos. Here are some more photos. Now we're going to come back to these photos at the end. So what is a construct of identity in science education? Identity has been defined and theorized in many different ways in the literature, depending on theoretical orientations and methodological approaches in science education. For example, based on a sociocultural theory, G describes identity research in education as being study of a certain kind of a person, where individuals have multiple identities that are related to their social performances rather than purely their unique being. In other words, as an individual could identify as an environmentalist, an athlete, a musician, a science person, a woman, man, child, and so on. However, research shows that in order to gain membership in science learning spaces or survive in science fields, quote unquote, people from non-dominant communities, women, had to constantly fragment their identities, social identities, emphasizing certain habits or aspects of their identity while suppressing or disengaging from others. More recent studies that draw on sociocultural perspectives have focused on understanding identity processes as a bridge for exploring how sociocultural contexts of learning foster or inhibit multiple identities, including science identities of young people from various backgrounds, especially from non-dominant communities, such as Black and Brown learners and students from Indigenous communities and Latinx students. These studies demonstrate that young people's social identity markers such as race, gender, class, and language differentially position and mediate their access to science practices, identity positions, and agency within learning spaces. For instance, a recent literature review showed that identity studies in mathematics and science education has become a field and a curriculum in which we still continue to rely on foundational conceptions of hierarchy, intelligence, and innateness, which gives emergence to the kinds of biases, stereotypes, and status differences within learning spaces that result in deficit-based discourses, which disproportionately affect young people and women from non-dominant communities. To this extent, the research suggests that succeeding at school has less to do with enacting actually certain kind of identities and more to do with fragmenting and suppressing identities and acting within narrowly defined and institutional views of what it means to be a good science student. Consequently, science learning and science identity development may be less contingent on the intellectual and cognitive abilities of students or knowledge or skills or actions of young people, and more to do and determined by their social, cultural, and linguistic positioning. So studies that use identity try to understand these processes and understand how historical sociocultural contexts impact who is participating currently in science and who's not. Speaking of historical background and the culture of science, a research by Hubbard, for instance, shows that science is a both social activity and the kind of knowledge about nature that this activity produces. People who do science and so produce the knowledge are called scientists, what we call the identities of scientists. Because of the time and place in which modern Western science, and that is what people nowadays mean by science, developed, scientists predominantly have been men, predominantly white men. As this kind of knowledge and its applications have expanded into dominant worldview over the past 2 or 3 centuries, white men have become too identified with all phases of it, the activity, product, application, the world outlook, that science as a both product and activity has become and thought of essentially masculine. So identity of science, we can say, and the kind of practices and the repertoires of practices that we identify as scientific came to be identified with more white Eurocentric men. So here is an example of it from our popular culture. Take a look at this photo. It's from Big Bang Theory. When we think of identities of scientists, and if you know this Big Bang Theory, here we have 4 men who are predominantly who would kind of carry the images of scientists, right? And then there is this white woman, Penny, who's considered and whose identity shows that she is not a scientist. As if, and even when you look at this picture, right, the stereotypical picture from the popular culture, it's as if these are the only people who do science. Where are Black people? Where are Hispanics? There are so many people of color, women of color, who are not represented in this picture. And when we look at the statistics in science or in general, what we construe as STEM, we know that only 7% of the computer science majors are from Hispanic and African American background. The percentage of women of color and indigenous people is even more severe. From the outset, right, these disciplines and education have been the center of the Constitution and reproduction of these normative hierarchies, enactment of these systems of knowing, what we call epistemic ways of knowing, and ontic ways, that is categorizations of being, falling to recognize and legitimize socially and culturally heterogeneous ways of being, doing, and knowing that exist, and framing of this diversity in deficit terms. Women are historically underrepresented in all modern STEM fields. So are people of color, including African American, Black, Hispanic, Indigenous populations, who've been historically underrepresented in all modern STEM fields. So, however, it's very important for us to also remember that these notions of identity are bounded by sociocultural time, space, and the period, and they are socially constructed. So what do we mean by social constructed nature of identity, and what does research in identity tells us about this notion of socially constructed identity marker? For instance, let's take a look at the gender as a socially constructed invisible identity marker. Okay, here is an example from a history. So historically, women were positioned as biologically lacking interest, disposition, skills, and intelligence to learn or to do STEM, which resulted in gender inequality that we know today. Here are some pictures from newspapers and magazines in which women have been described, or their roles and positions in society has been described. And now here is an example how these constructions ended up showing themselves in the research. For example, here is a research, one of the first, I would say, identity research that looked at whether or not girls want to participate in science. Here, if you read, complete the following statement in your own words. Write at least a full paragraph, but do not write more than a paragraph. When I think about scientists, I think of, if you are a boy, complete the following statements in your own words. If I were going to be a scientist, I should be like kind of a scientist who, and then boys will fill that part out. If you're a girl, you may complete either the sentence above or this one. If I were going to marry a scientist, I should like to marry the kind of a scientist who. And the next one, if you're a boy, complete the following statement in your own words. If I were going to be a scientist, I would not like to be a kind of a scientist who. If you're a girl, you may complete either the sentence above or this one. If I were going to marry a scientist, I would not like to marry the kind of a scientist who. This is from a famous major research from 1957. And as you can see, the ways in which gender or girls were constructed during that time is starkly different from the ways in which we think about science participation and girls' role in science participation. However, research continues to show that in order to gain membership in science learning spaces, women and people from non-dominant communities have to constantly fragment their identities, emphasizing certain habits or certain aspects of their identity while suppressing or disengaging from others. This is very interesting because when we actually look at the ways in which science is done in the labs, in the actual spaces of science, For instance, from the studies from Bruno Latour and Steve Wogar, they talk about how the ways in which science is constructed, socially constructed, both in relation to all these identity markers as well as the activities of science, is very different than what actually happens in scientific places. For instance, they talk about how science has become ready-made science in its compressed, formalized, abstract forms of product, as opposed to science in the making, science that it's being brought into existence with social, experimental, epistemological contingencies. Their two-year study in one of the science labs revealed that real-world science follows a circuitous and complicated path, one that does not conform to the fables of the scientific method. However, when it comes to actually the final product, it is written and it is portrayed as quote unquote objective. So how do we conceptualize these ideas, and what is this has to do with studying science identity? In my own research, I study science identity from a situated perspective. For me, identities of who we are and what we think about the world are inseparable. That is, identity is also connected to the ways of knowing the world, ways of experiencing the world, and it's situated in our day-to-day embodied experiences. So from these perspectives, identity construct is relational and social. It's tied to group perceptions, repertoires of participation, both in terms of performance and competence, and access to differential positioning, which includes roles, positions, and practices. At the same time, identity constitutes sociopolitical dimension of an activity system. When we talk about access to participate and communicate, these systems are also intertwined with how learners' identities are constructed and positioned within activity systems, such as learning spaces. Last, young people can also be positioned by storylines or based on perceived notions of performance, competence in local and larger spaces of action. So all of this is to say that depending on from which perspective and from which theory we look at the identity, it orients our position toward the methods and methodologies and conceptions, and as well as it orients us for the kind of research questions we can ask to understand the role of identity in science education. For example, here is one example from sociocultural perspective on identity. The notion from Svart and Prusak of narrative identity. Svart and Prusak describe narrative identity as a collection of identity narratives about one's sense of self with a discipline. So according to them, identity is not expressed by a collection of narratives. Identity is the collection of these identity narratives. For example, STEM is always a struggle for me. This is a reifying identity. STEM is biggest part of my school. Endorsable. I got highest grade in the test on my own. Significant. So if we were to take this position on identity, methodologically, we would do a narrative inquiry. It would be based on assumption people live and tell stories. People tell stories by the narratives available to them. People's narratives can reveal both personal events and social norms embedded in these events. So identities would be the narratives, which we hear and construct about ourselves based on our sociocultural experiences. These are, for instance, examples from Dr. G's research. One of the students who just defended her dissertation on identity research. So now I would like to give an example about my own research and the position and the theories that I use in my own research. So I look at the relationship between language and science identity development among emergent multilingual adolescents. Instead of following this language deficit-based frameworks that position students' perceived language proficiencies as limited or barriers to their learning, in my study, we take a resource-based approach to make visible the importance of diverse learners' cognitive resources in the processes of learning. We draw on a positioning theory to understand identity and study the extent to which resourceful positioning of students in their day-to-day practices and experiences in science can impact their science identity development. So because we need to understand the construct of identity, we'll look at, for instance, these students and how they are positioned in a larger discourse. For instance, unfortunately, multilingual students are often described and positioned in deficit terms in the context of the United States under the categories of English learners. And due to accountability and achievement measures, often excluded from science classes, especially at the elementary level. Emphasis often for them on learning is put on English, reading, writing, and comprehension rather than science. So taking this context, for instance, in one of our papers, we draw on the notion of identities and the concept of positioning to examine how access to various normative storylines and differential positionings result in multilingual learners' identifications or disidentifications with being a science person. To this end, we did a longitudinal case study with one of our participants and critical research partners, Cristiano, a multilingual adolescent. He participated as a student in our first research when we did the research in formal learning context of science in one of the middle schools. And then he also participated as a science research mentor in one of our programs at the university over the last 3 years. We did video, observational, and interview data collection from Cristiano's formal science classroom participation and during his time at the STEAM program at the university. And we run some narrative analysis. Our research showed that the school-based storylines of Cristiano as a science person often positioned him as a quote-unquote challenging or a problem student. We noticed during the observations his aptitude, interest, and ingenuities towards science. However, his science teacher often asked him to be quiet or to read or to write and asked him to be silent in the classroom. Although she recognized that he's smart and good in science, she rarely vocalized that to Cristiano. So he entered the STEAM program as someone who neither identified himself as a science person nor was recognized as such by others. During his participation in the program over the span of 3 years, he was positioned and recognized as a competent and capable scientist and an engineer over and over. He participated in science and engineering activities. He became a mentor at the program, and over time, during our interviews, he continues to identify himself with science and recognize himself as a science person. However, this identification was often conflated with the normative and dominant storylines of good versus bad student. That is, when we asked him about his science identity or his interest in science or becoming a scientist in the future, or in general, his interest in science, he often talked about himself that he is a good student now and therefore he's good at science. So what does these findings reveal to us? One of the things that is important for us to realize that the science spaces or current science spaces in the context of North America are racialized and based on dominant norms and conceptions and expectations. So when we think of identity as a situated experience means situated knowledges, situated identities. When students or young people are not given access to these experiences, positions, and roles being a scientist, and are not recognized as one, it's often marginalizes them and disfranchises them from normative science. However, does that mean that they are not a scientist or they don't carry the identities of scientists? For us, it goes back to the first activity. What are we seeing? When we describe people, when we see different activities. For instance, in these pictures, we see students engaging in various activities. They're actually from some of our research projects in which they are designing air filters. And these three pictures is from IDEO Studio, where Harvard or Yale or Stanford graduates, scientists, and engineers are sitting together and discussing about the engineering project. So it's difficult just by looking at the pictures, especially of these adults, right, to decide whether or not they are scientists. But they are scientists, they are engineers. However, when we think about students or young people, in order for us to think about the science, we need to be seeing something particular related to science, which according to us is problematic. So for instance, the first picture here, right? Is this student doing science? So evidence just by looking at this picture, we may be saying, we don't know. How about the second picture? Again, maybe some of the tools will signify that these three students are engaging in some sort of a science practice, right? Maybe drawing or writing explanations or observations. Here in the third picture, it's much more obvious. However, according to our research right now, students are actually bringing their social identities into science classrooms and science learning contexts. And it's important to draw on those social identities and not to separate them as one or another. Again, this is based on our theoretical and methodological position currently. Depending on the methodological and theoretical positions, different researchers can be looking at identity differently. But one thing is clear, identity research is a vast field with vast possibilities. Thank you for participating in this session today, and I'm looking forward to hearing your questions.